Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation and entrepreneurship. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you authors, corporate innovation managers, entrepreneurs, and above all else, thought leaders on the topics of innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement. Future Squared brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you successfully navigate your innovation journey. Every Monday, I'll bring you a world-class thought leader such as Steve Blank, Alex Osterwalder, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, or Whitney Johnson, just to name a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you some quick digestible insights myself to help end your week on a high before you head off for the weekend. Future Squared is proudly brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub, school, and consultancy that works with large organizations to help them adopt the mindset, methodologies, and tools required to explore new business models and disruptive innovation in an era of rapid change. If your organization needs support coming up with ideas, testing and turning those ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit Collective Campus online at www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. Welcome back to Future Squared. Today I'll be speaking with Eric Almquist. He's a partner in Bain & Company's Boston office. He's a leader in Bain's advanced analytics practice and a member of the firm's global customer strategy and marketing practice. Eric has more than 37 years of management consulting experience and delivers strategies that work for leading companies. Eric has contributed to such publications as the Harvard Business Review, Marketing Management, Journal of Brand Management, and Design Management Journal. He was the recipient of a Social Science Research Council Foreign Area Fellowship and has served as a trustee of the Marketing Science Institute. Prior to joining Bain in 2007, Eric built extensive experience as a leader in the customer strategy sector, where he founded one of the first comprehensive marketing science capabilities in the consulting industry. Most recently, Eric co-authored The Elements of Value, a fascinating article and product development tool which was published by Harvard Business Review. So with that, it gives me much pleasure to introduce you to Eric Almquist. Welcome to the show, Eric.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for asking me to join.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program. You're joining us from Boston, Massachusetts. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Fantastic. So you base yourself there as part of Bain & Company?
Yes, I have been with Bain & Company for 10 years as a partner, roughly. And I was a partner with a previous firm for 28 years. So I've actually been in consulting a long time.
Yeah, fantastic.
And that's all been in Boston.
Yeah, excellent. And does that make you a Boston Celtics fan?
No, it does. I don't go to games a lot, but I do support the Celtics as well as the Red Sox.
Yeah, so. Of course. It would be sacrilege to support anybody else, right?
That's right. You can't get away with that in Boston.
Cool. And I know aside from consulting, and if what your LinkedIn profile says is correct, you also have an interest in photography.
I do. I've had a long interest since I was 16 years old, and I continue to do photography. At the moment, I'm mostly taking pictures of my grandson, but I do a lot of different kinds of work.
Yeah, excellent. Have you shot any cool spots lately, or other than your grandson, who I'm sure is a very cute little specimen?
Yeah. A project that I started in 2003. I think I'm one of the few photographers. I've had a long interest in the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project and things related to nuclear weapons. And I have visited all three of the original bomb sites, Trinity in New Mexico, Hiroshima, as well as Nagasaki. So I think I'm one of the few people who's visited all three of those sites and photographed them today, which is it's quite a project. And I'm still working to. I've showed a few of them publicly, but I'm still working to find a venue for the work. We'll see.
Excellent. Any of those images available online, or?
Actually, they're not. You know, my attitude is the probably the last thing the world needs is another photographic website. But if I do ever retire, that will be one of my projects.
Yeah, fantastic.
So,
Cool. Okay,
yeah.
Eric. So I guess aside from photography today, I wanted to chat with you about your latest publication in Harvard Business Review, which is called "The Elements of Value," an article you co-penned with Bain and Company colleagues John Senior and Nicholas Block. The article
Yes.
essentially contends that when consumers evaluate products, they weigh its perceived value against the asking price, and that marketers have spent a disproportionate amount of time focusing on the price side of the equation. However, what consumers truly value can be difficult to pin down and psychologically complicated. And so you've identified 30 elements of value that can help product teams come up with new concepts, essentially by anticipating what people might consider valuable. Can you tell us a little bit more about how this came about?
Sure. I've been thinking about this problem for a long time. I've spent my whole career doing customer insight and marketing science work.
Mm-hmm.
I'll spare you the details of all the years, but I've spoken to thousands of consumers. I've managed cases for clients that have been, fundamental explorations of consumer needs, et cetera, usually often in the support of new product development and so forth. And it struck me over the years that there are a couple sort of paradoxes as it relates to this topic. One is that economists haven't really written that much about value, even though we know that value is what drives the economy. There's been a little bit written in the field of philosophy, concepts of extrinsic and intrinsic value. But there hasn't been a lot done. There's actually been more done in media studies. There's a field that started many, many decades ago called uses and gratification theory, which for some reason got stuck in media studies. One of the original books was called Radio and the Printed Page, and the question was whether, as people discovered radio, whether they would still value newspapers. And of course, this is played out again and again. It was TV and the movies, then it was the internet and all other forms of media, and it still continues today. And this field it's actually a pretty interesting field. So that in part inspired me. So that was sort of one paradox. Another paradox is that I've seen over and over again in my business career that there's a fundamental asymmetry in management, and that it's easier to control costs than it is to grow revenue. To grow profits, one can simply reduce costs, fire people, etc. It's much harder to grow revenue because you have to think of new products and services or add value to existing products and services. That tends to be harder. So I've been grappling with these things, and at the heart of it, it seemed to me there was really a need for something that would make value easier to manage and easier to think about.
Yeah.
So that's how it got started. I've known of Abraham Maslow's fundamental psychological work for many years, and I've also been impressed that many, many people in business have studied Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but very few of them have actually put it to use. And so that was another inspiration to really work with Maslow's hierarchy and make it more useful in a business context.
Definitely. And I'm just looking at the elements of value pyramid that you've put together, which essentially reminds me quite a bit of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you have functional elements at the bottom, emotional next up, and then the last two towards the tip of the pyramid are life-changing, and then social impact, which is all about SelfTranscendence. So do you want to perhaps talk us through the different levels in the pyramid and how they relate to, say, product development and successful innovation efforts?
Sure. Just to go back to Maslow for 1 second,
Sure.
he had a hierarchy that was, as I said, fundamentally more about human motivation.
Mm-hmm.
It started with physiological needs, literally food, water, warmth, rest,
Mm-hmm.
then safety needs, then belongingness and love needs and esteem needs, etc. As you worked up the pyramid. He actually added, for most people think that self-actualization is the top of Maslow's hierarchy, but he added self-transcendence,
Mm.
which is about altruism, charitable giving, and,
Yeah.
and social consciousness. He added that about 10 years after his original work.
Mm-hmm.
So inspired by that, as we thought about applying this to business, we began to search for elements that would follow a similar hierarchy. We actually started above basic physiological needs like calories and water.
Uh-huh.
We started really with functional elements that can help. Even though they're functional, they can certainly help products and services rise above commodity status.
Mm.
So the functional elements are things like saves time, reduces effort, simplifies, avoids hassles, reduces cost, makes money, reduces risk, and so on. I won't read through all of them.
Mm-hmm.
You can see these online, but those are some of the basic functional ones. And actually, I'll get to this in a moment. The functional ones are very, very important because some of the online players are literally crushing these elements. They're delivering them extremely well, and the functional ones alone can be very, very powerful.
Mm.
If we go up a level, emotional elements, this has to do with things like reducing anxiety, rewarding consumers, wellness, therapeutic value, nostalgia, fun and entertainment,
Mm-hmm.
those sorts of things. They're more emotionally engaging types of value. They tend to be very powerful. There's some evidence that consumers, at least in the States, are spending more and more money on experiences than on just simple products.
Yeah.
So, for example, the number of restaurants in the U.S. economy is many-fold more than it used to be 40 or 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just an example. Then as we move up another level, there are what we call life-changing elements, which has to do with things like motivation, providing hope, heirloom, which has to do with preserving value for the next generations, affiliation and belonging. So those are what we call the life-changing elements. And finally, there's the social impact element is self-transcendence, which we carried forward from Abraham Maslow,
Mm-hmm.
and it has to do with, as I said before, altruism, charitable giving, and so forth. If you look at a company like Tom's, which is a shoe company here in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
very popular with the millennial generation, they give a pair of shoes away every time a consumer buys one of their pairs of shoes. It's just part of their value proposition. You don't have to pay more for that. You don't have to make a choice around that. It just happens. And that's a pretty good example, we believe, of self-transcendence. Obviously, charitable organizations of many kinds, that self-transcendence is really part of their core value proposition. That's why they're in existence.
Mm.
But even for-profit companies can benefit from that if the proposition is well crafted.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I had the opportunity to speak with Karen Dillon last week, who also penned a HBR article recently and co-penned the latest Clayton Christensen book, Competing Against Luck, which I suppose explores at depth the jobs to be done, I suppose, philosophy, where products are about more than just the functional. They're about the emotional, they're about the social, they're about how they make you feel about yourself. And it seems as if the 30 elements of value help take, functional, social, emotional jobs and so on, but then break them down into these elements of value. And just to give the audience another example of that, just yesterday I was buying some shampoo, and I ended up buying shampoo that was 3 times more expensive than everything else nearby, purely because it was from this company called Thank You. And they're a not-for-profit, and all of their proceeds go towards projects in developing economies such as Sri Lanka, and you can actually track the proceeds. There's a little code on the bottle. You can track where that money is actually going, what it's going towards, what community, and so on. And so clearly that wasn't a functional choice. Clearly the choice was about a little bit of emotional, some of that self-transcendence, trying to give back, may not have the opportunity to do so during the day, and therefore you look for other ways to kind of give back wherever you can. So it's about much more than just the shampoo making your hair feel nice and shiny.
Right, exactly. What's interesting about that example, Steve, is that not only is self-transcendence an element that's in play there, but it sounds like through the internet or through your smartphone, you can get information about where your money is going. So there's an aspect of informs, which is one of the functional elements. There might be also some connections to local communities where that money is going. So there sounds like there's more than just self-transcendence at work there in the value. There's an engagement that's coming from knowing where your money's going.
Yeah, definitely. And would you say that there's usually a number of different elements in play?
Yes, I can talk about that. I did want to say one thing about the Clayton Christensen and team article. I have a lot of respect for their work. I think the notion of jobs to be done is very, very powerful, and I think the two articles are in fact complementary to each other. What we tried to do was try to be more explicit that the jobs to be done, they may be infinite in shades of gray, but we think the 30 elements of value really are kind of a playbook around that theme, so that we've tried to identify 30 starting points, if you will, that we know are important in the economy, just to help people get started. I've seen so many innovation projects, so many ideation sessions, so much consumer research that starts with kind of a blank page. And frankly, we know a lot collectively as consultants and researchers, and my goal was really to help people get started. The jobs to be done, I think one other comment I'd make about it is oftentimes consumers don't know what the job is that they want to get done until they see it. So sometimes it can be hard to uncover them. But that's true in lots of consumer insight work. You ask about the number of elements. Most of the companies that we have studied are delivering on relatively few elements of value.
Right.
So there are, for example, we set a hurdle rate for analyzing companies that we believe are doing very well on a number of elements, and the hurdle rate is rather it's a bit arbitrary. We chose 50% of the respondents giving an 8 or above on an 11-point scale, 0 to 10, which, by the way, is the same scale that Net Promoter Score uses, which has also been a Bain development. And just to give you an example, Apple clears the hurdle on 11 elements of value. Amazon clears the hurdle. Sorry, I'm getting an echo here. Clears the hurdle on. Sorry, let me start again. Amazon clears the hurdle on 8 elements of value, mostly functional.
Mm-hmm.
But then it trails off from there. We actually had a number of companies in our original sample of 47 companies who were clearing the hurdle on no elements of value. Wow. That is, they were really not succeeding in clearing the hurdle rate at all.
Right.
And we think for those companies that is going to be a real challenge for them to survive unless they are delivering more value. Frankly, we have analyzed a number of other patterns here. One is that the smartphone manufacturers are doing very well. As I mentioned, Apple delivers on 11 elements of value. But if you think of smartphones, they actually are an element of value sort of bundle. One's whole life is in those phones now. Your money is there, your friends are there, your entertainment is there. Rewards can be there for certain companies. There's motivation. There are apps to help you exercise and apps to help you eat better. Mm-hmm. I mean, really, those phones cover much of the hierarchy, not all of it. But so the phone manufacturers have an advantage that those phones now contain a microcosm of our lives. Very, very important. I mean, imagine going back to a time when one didn't have a smartphone. It's inconceivable. Yeah. But in general, the digital players are doing better than the omni-channel players if you look at retail. So if you compare online pure plays like Amazon or Zappos or Netflix, Netflix also still sends discs out, but largely it's a digital play now. Mm-hmm. But they are doing better than their counterparts in brick and mortar retail, and the reason they're doing better is largely because they are taking a lot of pain and compromises out of consumer life. So these are the functional elements of value. They save you time, reduces effort in ordering. You don't have to go to stores. You don't have to experience stockouts and things like that to the same extent. So the digital players are doing well largely because of that. We also see evidence that more traditional store-based retailers tend to perform better on more of the emotional elements. Right. So having to do with badge value and aesthetics and things like that. We don't know how long that advantage will last, and I am concerned that some retailers at least are reducing the number of people in their stores, et cetera, which is maybe one of their core advantages. So we'll see how this plays out over the next 10 years. But those are some of the patterns we're observing.
Yeah, excellent. And I mean, you've mentioned the digital players versus brick and mortar firms. Have you managed, did your research uncover any striking differences across industries? So, for example, telco versus health and fitness. Was there any striking differences there in terms of the elements of value?
Yes, there are differences, and we actually looked at the relationship between the elements of value and both NPS, Net Promoter Score, mm-hmm. as well as growth. One thing that's very interesting is that across all industries, this was based, by the way, on some advanced analytics we did on the survey data, something called random forest regression. We looked at essentially the correlation between the elements and NPS, and it turns out that across every industry we've studied, quality, which is really the basic sort of integrity of products and services, mm-hmm. quality is the number one driver across every industry. And we think that is because it's essentially table stakes now. We're almost 40 years into the TQM movement, and the improvement of basic quality in products and services. It's a driver, an important driver, because it really has to be there for consumers to consider it. But then we see a lot of other differences occurring across industries. So with apparel retailers and discount retail, variety is the number two driver.
Mm-hmm.
That's also true in grocery. But if you look at smartphones, quality is number one, but reduces effort is number two there. Obviously, for cell phone service providers, mobile providers, quality is number one, but connection is number two. Obviously, that's a fundamentally important element in that industry.
Yeah.
Consumer banking, quality is number one, but provides access, through ATMs and branches and so forth, is important. And then, avoiding hassles and reducing anxiety is important there as well. So it varies across industry.
Yeah.
And some of that is published in the HBR article.
Yeah, fantastic. And I guess you mentioned there that there's a correlation between NPS scores and the use of elements, and that organizations that score highly and I suppose use a number of the different elements tend to have a higher NPS score. And you mentioned some organizations earlier who just didn't get above the hurdle for any of the elements. And today, more than ever, it seems as if, well, it doesn't seem as if customers expect a lot more in terms of the experience, in terms of the company's altruistic values and so on. So how important is it that organizations who don't score very highly on any of the elements start to think about integrating them into their business models?
Well, it's absolutely essential. Just to give you some data on this topic, we looked at NPS. We also looked at recent growth trajectories.
Mm-hmm.
Companies that are scoring 0 on the number of high-value elements they have, that's the hurdle I mentioned before, they have an average NPS of 3. Companies that are scoring on 4 or more elements of value at the hurdle rate or above have an average NPS of 58. So, and that is that's an enormous difference, and a score of 58 is very high as the world goes. So, these are big differences. And on the growth rates, again, companies that are clearing the hurdle rate on 0 of the elements of value, their growth is actually negative. For companies that are scoring well on 4+ elements, their average growth rate was almost 13%.
Yeah.
And if you compound that year after year, it's a pretty staggering difference. So, for companies that are not doing well on the elements of value or any of the elements of value, the key thing is they have to do 2 things. They have to start closing the gaps against their competitors. And number 2 is they need to think of new forms of value that they can provide to deliberately, make choices about where they want to add value going forward. And as I said before, I fear that, if one is not, competitive on any of the elements, that bodes poorly for your future.
Yeah, definitely. And I think those numbers provide quite compelling reasons for organizations to seriously look at what elements they're using. An NPS score of 3 compared to 54. For our audience who
58, yeah.
58, sorry. For our audience who may not be familiar with NPS, anything above 50 is considered excellent, whereas anything above 0 is considered positive, but 3 is barely even crossing the line. So there's a massive difference between 54 and 3.
Yeah.
And I guess taking into account those growth numbers, the negative growth versus the positive compounded growth as well. That's just fascinating stuff. And I guess on the product development, so you mentioned that you've no doubt partaken in thousands of hours of early stage, ideation programs and product development initiatives and whatnot. Do you have any examples of companies that you've worked with who've put the elements of value at work in product development?
Yes. I mean, we've done a number of applications since we've developed it. And by the way, the elements have been in development for about 5 years. So we had different versions. At one point, we were at 24 elements of value. We kind of stopped at 30. And there may be other elements that we will discover or that will be invented. But
Sure.
we've all along the way, we put the elements to work largely in innovation efforts. So we have, just to give you an example, this was work we did last year for a bank here in the United States. We helped them develop a new, basic checking account proposition. And we use the elements of value in a kind of an agile consumer insight project to help uncover new elements that could be added to that checking account. And I can't go into great details about it, but there were a number of elements that we seriously considered, such as rewards and access and risk reduction, anxiety reduction. We settled on one of those to build a prototype and several variations on that prototype. Then we took that into some pretty sophisticated research involving choice-based conjoint, also known as discrete choice analysis, and from there into pilots. And it's currently in market in pilot form as we speak. So that's a pretty typical case along these lines. We've also applied it to new value propositions in kind of construction equipment, chainsaws and things like that, where there's a lot of a need for better ergonomics and safety and risk reduction, that sort of thing. And a number of, we've applied earlier versions of it in other financial services like investment advisory services, that kind of thing.
Excellent. And I mean, thinking out loud now, I suppose when people have, say, you mentioned chainsaws there, and when you're selling a chainsaw, no doubt you're selling it to somebody who may, work in a particular trade, or maybe they already have a chainsaw of some type, and we're dealing with lots of barriers to switching, human barriers, such as, well, I don't want to risk loss. What if it's not as good as what I've currently got? And the conventional wisdom coming out of places like Silicon Valley is that, hey, you need to be 10 times better. Otherwise, if it's a little bit better, people will just take what they currently have. They're resistant to change. They're not going to move along. But it sounds as if when I look at those NPS scores that you were talking about earlier, going from, say, 3 up to 58, that by incorporating some of these elements of value, you start to differentiate yourself and start to build that product which may be 5 or 10 times better than what's already on the market. Would you say that's correct? Or
yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And we're at a point in economic history where frankly, with mobile phones, with the technology, the digital technology, we're at a point where it is possible to do that. I mean, imagine, just look at what Amazon has done since they were founded in, I believe, 1995. It started with one-click ordering in some ways. Well, it started when they began, so they were a category killer for books, and then they began through the element access and variety. They began to add other product lines, and of course they've just done that relentlessly. And then in 1999 they added one-click ordering, which they actually patented it. Which was, in terms of, simplification, reducing effort, etc. And they have just been a juggernaut in understanding. Obviously, they didn't have the pyramid that we've created, but they instinctively as entrepreneurs, Bezos and his team instinctively understood this. They've added one element of value after another. They're now at 8, but they have, they've delivered on their 8 elements of value in very clever ways throughout their customer journey. So, for example, they added Prime, which was really about saving time and saving money in its original form. But then to Prime, they added access to music, access to videos. That has to do with entertainment and access and variety. They then added free photo storage, which is about risk reduction. You can store your photos in the cloud, and if your computer blows up or you don't have something backed up, you've got protection. And they've just done one thing after another like that. One of their current devices is called Echo, which allows you to order verbally, sitting at your kitchen table or somewhere or at your desk, and that has a form of entertainment. Obviously, it's a little bit like 2001: A Space Odyssey, I suppose. And then they have these dash ordering buttons that you can. It's very clever the way they did this. Rather than having one device that allows you to order lots of different things, they have a device for let's say diapers that would allow you to put that device in the baby's room at the changing table, which is where you're going to be thinking about, do I have enough diapers? And then there's another one for ordering detergents, for Tide, for example, that goes in the laundry room, and so forth. So they've been very clever about just coming up with these ideas and just relentlessly adding value to their fundamental proposition.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess finally, on organizations who are looking to research opportunities to start incorporating some of the elements into their innovation efforts, I imagine they could run, say, ideation sessions, customer-centric prototyping sessions. I mean, what can organizations start to do as a first step if they are looking to incorporate some of these elements?
Yeah, I think the first step is to really start thinking about value, and we've tried to help people do that through this article. And what I mean by that is actually delivering value that will be perceived and felt and experienced by the consumer. There might be a tendency for some people to view the elements of value as kind of maybe part of their brand strategy. But I would caution people not to go down that route because my strong belief, and I've got a lot of data over the years to show this, that one has to actually deliver value before it can accrue to your brand. You can advertise, you can do all sorts of things to try to make people think that you're delivering that value, but it will be a very limited time period where they're duped if you're not if you're not delivering that value. So the first thing I actually think is to really internalize the concepts of the elements of value and to think about that. The next step is to sort of formally set up sessions and so forth to begin to think about the elements in a systematic way and figure out where to add elements of value. And then obviously there's other kinds of customer insight work that one can do to narrow down the field, before you actually start prototyping products and taking things to market.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, Eric, well, thank you so much for that. We are down to the lightning round. So this is when I ask all of my guests 3 questions, 2 hypotheticals, and 1 on lifestyle design. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Let's do it. So question number 1, Eric, is if you could work for any company at any stage of the company lifecycle, who would it be and why?
I guess at this point in business history, I am most fascinated by Amazon and how they do what they do, how they come up with their ideas. So I would say I would love to be either working for Amazon or a fly on the wall there.
Yeah.
It's been such a powerful company and such a threat to so many other companies that I'd love to see what goes on there inside the company.
Yeah, definitely. And I've mentioned their monthly failure award on one of our previous podcasts, where people who run an experiment, fail, learn something, and share that with the organization qualify for an award, which basically celebrates failure. But they only qualify for the award if they ran the experiment without permission, which I think speaks volumes about the culture that they've got at Amazon.
Yeah, yeah.
Excellent. So question number 2, Eric, is if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and why, and what would you ask?
I would ask Albert Einstein about how he came up with the theory of relativity and and how he imagined those first few articles that he published over 100 years ago. I believe 1906, his miracle year. I guess if I could ask one person a question, that would be it.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think that's the first time anyone said Albert Einstein. So in a league of your own, we often get a lot of people saying, Abraham Lincoln or Thomas Jefferson and things like that. So it's good to have Albert on the list now. And finally, the last question is on lifestyle design, Eric. So I speak with a lot of people who are doing amazing things in their fields, and just keen to find out whether or not you have any rituals or routines that you partake in on a daily basis.
Yes. One routine, it's kind of a negative routine, but I very rarely watch television. And in fact, every year that goes by, I watch less and less. I would much rather spend my time exploring online. I think the internet, both through computers and smartphones, is truly miraculous.
Yeah.
And my wife and I often sit at the dinner table. This is particularly true when our children are around. But I can't tell you how many dinners we will have where we look something up on Wikipedia or on some other source. And I think back to 30 years ago when we didn't have that kind of capability. I suppose we looked in the Oxford English Dictionary or some other place or an encyclopedia, but it has just changed the way one absorbs knowledge in such an amazing way. It's a thrill to be alive and with this technology available.
Definitely, and I think Peter Diamandis from Singularity University often says that children growing up today have more access to information than the President of the United States had, say, 15 years ago.
Right, exactly.
It's just crazy to think that. The only thing that I don't like about being able to look up anything on Wikipedia is that the back and forth arguments that used to take place where it was like, no, I'm right, no, you're right, that's gone. It's just Google and we find the answer, right? So it's
absolutely right.
Yeah, it's taken a bit of the fun out of that.
Yeah, that's true. But what a world. It's just incredible.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Cool, Eric. So what we will do, we'll share a copy of the Elements of Value article, which is on Harvard Business Review, in the show notes. Is there anywhere else our audience should go to find out a little bit more about yourself and your work?
There is there's an article I published in 2001 in Harvard Business Review about experimental marketing, and in particular multivariate testing. It was ahead of its time, I think. So that's one resource. Another is there is a webinar with slides on hbr.com that they can look at if they're interested in a little more of the research behind the elements of value.
Excellent. Cool. Well, we'll share that in the show notes for our listeners. So thanks again for giving up some time today, Eric. You've been an awesome guest, and I'm sure our audience will get a lot of value out of that. Excuse the pun. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, Steve. This has been great, and I look forward to listening to some of your other podcasts as well.
Fantastic. Cheers. Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat with Eric Almquist. As promised, I'll share the article in the show notes for you lucky listeners. As always, if you're picking up what we're putting down, please take a minute to like, share, or subscribe to Future Squared on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. As always, if you want to find out more about Collective Campus, you can do so at www.collectivecamp.us, where you can also gain access to over 100 blog posts on corporate innovation, other podcasts, videos, webinars, infographics, and download a copy of my book, The Innovation Manager's Handbook. Until next time, Future Squared out.